A man left his camp, but he will regret it forever. What police found next shocked everyone. One clue after another began to paint a terrifying picture of his last steps. Were these signs of a desperate escape, or something far darker hiding in the woods? Watch closely, because the evidence tells a story more chilling than words ever could. Under the wide sky of a remote American village, where the days moved slowly and neighbors often knew more about one another than they should, a man and a woman had built a quiet life for themselves in a modest wooden house at the edge of a narrow gravel road, the kind of place where dogs barked at passing trucks and the evening air carried the smell of freshly cut grass and wood smoke, and everything seemed steady and uneventful until one summer night when flames rose suddenly against the dark horizon and changed everything, because that house, their house, was on fire, and the orange glow lit up the silent fields around it while smoke twisted upwards into the wind, and neighbors, startled from their porches and living rooms, rushed outside, shouting to one another, trying to understand if what they saw was real, and soon someone dialed the fire department, their voice trembling as they gave directions in a panic, because fires were rare here and nobody expected one to break out in a home so well kept. Yet by the time the engines roared down the road with sirens cutting through the countryside silence, the flames had already consumed most of the roof, and people stood back, shielding their faces from the heat, whispering about the couple who lived there, wondering where they were, shouting their names into the night, and when the firemen charged in with hoses and axes, neighbors clung to hope that the man and woman had escaped, perhaps running into the woods or down the dirt road for safety. But as the blaze was finally beaten back and the last embers hissed beneath streams of water, the truth became impossible to ignore. The couple was nowhere to be found. No bodies, no frantic survivors, not even a trail of footprints in the wet ash, only charred beams and collapsed furniture, as if the fire had erased them completely, leaving everyone in stunned confusion. Because how could two people vanish from their own burning home without leaving a trace? And as the days passed and investigators combed through the ruins, they found nothing that explained the disappearance, no evidence of forced escape, no belongings outside, just silence and unanswered questions. And soon whispers grew among the villagers, theories rising like smoke. Perhaps they had fled secretly, perhaps the fire had been set to hide something, perhaps someone else was involved. But each theory collapsed under the weight of the impossibility of it all. Because the couple had lived quietly, with no known enemies, no debts, no strange visitors, and their lives, up until that night, had been simple, routine, almost ordinary. Yet their absence made ordinary explanations feel inadequate. And so the search expanded beyond the ruins, volunteers walking the fields and forests, calling their names, local police setting up checkpoints on the main roads, helicopters circling overhead scanning the landscape with infrared cameras. But each attempt returned empty, as though the land itself had swallowed them whole, and every passing day deepened the mystery, until a month had crawled by and their house, now only a blackened skeleton, stood like a grim monument to the unanswered questions. And neighbors began to accept that maybe they would never know what truly happened, until one morning when a farmhand on the property of the old man who lived just a few houses down, a reclusive figure known to everyone but rarely spoken to, walked into the barn looking for tools and instead froze at the sound of muffled voices, strained and hoarse, and when he pushed deeper inside, past stacks of hay bales and rusted equipment, he stumbled upon the missing couple, alive but broken, tied and shivering, their faces marked with exhaustion and fear, their eyes wide with the desperate relief of being seen at last, and the truth, as it unraveled, stunned the entire village. The old man, quiet and solitary, had taken them the night of the fire, holding them captive in his barn, while everyone else scoured the mountains and rivers for their traces, torturing them in ways the couple could barely bring themselves to describe, hiding his crime in plain sight as neighbors walked by his fence each day without suspicion. And when police stormed the property and led him away in handcuffs, his lined face betraying no remorse, the entire community was left reeling, wondering how they had overlooked such darkness in their midst. Yet for all the horror of what the couple endured, they survived, and though their home was gone, reduced to ashes and memory, they had their freedom again, while the man who had stolen it sat behind bars, and still people asked themselves the same questions late at night. Why did he do it? How had he hidden it so long? And what other secrets might rest behind the quiet walls of the houses they thought they knew so well? Questions that lingered long after the fire was extinguished and the smoke had cleared, casting a shadow over the village. That would not fade quickly, because once innocence is shattered, it cannot easily return, and everyone understood that the mystery of what had truly burned that night was not just a house, but the sense of safety they had all once taken for granted. The days following the shocking discovery in the old man's barn left the village in a strange haze, where disbelief, outrage, and guilty relief all collided in the minds of the people who had once lived side by side with both the missing couple and the man who had imprisoned them. And as news spread through radio reports and local newspapers, journalists flocked to the small community, parking their vans on the narrow gravel roads and turning the once quiet place into a spotlight of national attention because the story was too bizarre to ignore. A couple vanishing during a house fire, the month-long search, and the eventual revelation that they had been alive the whole time, hidden only steps away from their neighbors, suffering at the hands of someone they all thought of as a harmless recluse, and as the couple was taken to a hospital in the nearest town, their bodies weak but intact, police began piecing together the chain of events that led to the crime, starting with the fire itself, which investigators now believed was no accident, but rather a calculated distraction, a way for the old man to cover the abduction he had been planning, because fire destroyed evidence, fire made people panic, fire explained sudden disappearance without leaving traces, and though he never confessed directly, the forensic team confirmed traces of accelerant on the ruins, a detail that made the entire community realize that everything they had thought of as random disaster had in fact been the beginning of something far more sinister. And in the days of questioning, the couple gave fragmentary testimonies, their voices unsteady as they described being dragged from their home during the chaos, gagged and bound before they could call for help, carried across the dirt road to the barn where they were kept in near darkness, surviving on scraps of food and water, subjected to cruelty and torment they could not fully describe without breaking down. And though the old man's motives remained unclear, whether madness, resentment, or some warped obsession, his actions left scars that would take far longer to heal than the visible burns on their skin, and as the trial approached, the entire community found itself reliving the night of the fire again and again, testifying, recalling details they once thought irrelevant, such as the way the old man had stood silently at the edge of the crowd that night, his expression unreadable as neighbors screamed and the fire roared, a detail that, in hindsight, seemed almost like a confession none of them had recognized. And though justice seemed inevitable with a mountain of evidence against him, the process of exposing every fact, every memory, made the story darker with each passing day, because it revealed not just what he had done but how easily it had been hidden in plain sight, how trust and routine had blinded everyone to the danger in their midst. And meanwhile the couple, though grateful to be free, found themselves struggling to feel at home anywhere, because their house was gone, their sanctuary turned to ash, and the barn where they had been imprisoned haunted their thoughts in every quiet moment. So they lived temporarily with relatives, answering endless questions from detectives, therapists, and reporters, their lives becoming a case file and a headline instead of the quiet days they had once known. And at night the woman would sometimes wake up screaming, convinced she still heard footsteps in the hay, while the man sat awake staring at the walls, trying to remember what it felt like to believe in safety. And yet, as weeks passed, the community rallied around them, bringing meals, offering places to stay, organizing fundraisers to help them rebuild, gestures of kindness that, though small, reminded the couple that not everyone was cruel, and though they accepted the help, they also noticed the unease in people's eyes, the way conversations fell silent when they walked by, as though everyone was reminded of how fragile life could be. And in court the old man sat with a blank stare, never explaining his reasons, never showing regret, his silence becoming its own kind of torment for the couple, because they could not understand why it had been them, why their lives had been chosen to be destroyed. But despite this, the legal system moved forward, piece by piece, with prosecutors laying out the evidence, witnesses describing the fire, the farmhand recounting the moment of discovery, and experts presenting forensic proof of accelerants and restraints, building a case so solid that the jury's verdict seemed predetermined. And when at last he was sentenced to a long imprisonment, the courtroom exhaled. Yet the couple did not feel the triumph they expected, because punishment could not undo the month they had lost, nor erase the memory of the barn, but it gave them closure, a thin line between past and future. And after the sentencing they returned to the village, walking past the ruins of their home where weeds now grew through the charred foundation, pausing to look at what once was their life, and though the woman's hand trembled, she whispered that they would rebuild, because to let the memory of that night destroy them completely would mean the old man had won. And as neighbors watched from a respectful distance, they realized the couple's return was not just survival but defiance, a choice to live in the very place where their nightmare had begun, because to run away would be to surrender to fear. And so the second chapter of their story was not only about cruelty and crime but about resilience, about how two people scarred by horror could still stand together, facing the ashes of their past, determined to write something new from the wreckage, even as the unanswered questions lingered in every corner of their minds. Questions that might never find answers, but would shape the way they lived for the rest of their days. After the old man had been taken away to prison and the horrifying ordeal finally ended, the couple tried to return to their old lives in the little village where everything had once been simple, but as the weeks turned into months they realized that nothing would ever feel the same again because the scars left behind by captivity were not just on their bodies but etched deep into their minds, making them see their once peaceful home in a different light, filled with shadows that never seemed to leave even on the brightest days. And though neighbors came often bringing pies, fresh milk, bread, and words of sympathy, there was always a silence that hung over the house where the fire had destroyed so much, a silence that seemed to ask questions no one dared to voice, questions about why the old man, who had been a familiar figure in the community, had turned into such a monster, questions about how no one had noticed the signs that he was capable of such cruelty, questions that gnawed at the couple in their sleepless nights when the memory of being locked inside the dusty barn returned with painful clarity, the smell of hay mixing with the dampness of fear, the sound of footsteps approaching the door making their hearts freeze even though the footsteps belonged to rescuers now and not to their tormentor, and though they tried to plant new flowers in their garden, to repaint the walls, to fill the rooms with music again, the shadows clung stubbornly, forcing them to confront the truth that healing would take more than time. It would take courage, conversations, and choices they had not imagined they would have to make, and slowly they began to speak not only with each other but with investigators, journalists, and eventually even psychologists who wanted to understand how something so dark could happen in a place so seemingly ordinary. And each time they told their story it felt like tearing open a wound, but also like cleansing it, letting light in, and the community listened, horrified yet fascinated, ashamed yet curious, because the story was no longer just about two people trapped in a barn but about all of them, about how evil can hide in plain sight, about how trust can be betrayed, about how vigilance is necessary even in villages where everyone thinks they know each other. And as these conversations spread beyond the village to nearby towns and finally to the city when newspapers printed the account, the couple found themselves unwillingly turned into symbols of survival, their faces appearing on television, their words quoted in articles, their pain transformed into lessons for strangers. And while it was overwhelming to be so exposed, they also began to understand that perhaps this was the way forward. Perhaps their suffering could prevent another hidden barn from swallowing someone else. And with that realization they began to rebuild not only their home but their sense of purpose, inviting children from the village to play in their yard, organizing gatherings where people shared stories of fear and resilience, even visiting schools to talk about vigilance and kindness, and slowly, very slowly, the nightmares began to lose their sharp edges. The barn in their memories became less suffocating, replaced by the sound of children laughing under the trees, the sight of sunflowers growing tall near their gate, and though they would never forget what the old man did to them, they decided not to let his shadow define the rest of their lives, choosing instead to build something brighter from the ashes, something that even he, locked in his cell with his silence, could never take away from them. And yet sometimes when the night was too quiet and the wind carried a sound that reminded them of footsteps on dry grass, they still felt the old fear rise up, a reminder that the past was never completely gone, only folded into the fabric of their story. But unlike before, they no longer felt alone in facing it, because now the whole village knew, the whole community had seen, and together they all carried the weight of what had happened, not as an unbearable curse but as a lesson carved into their shared memory. And so the couple walked forward, hand in hand, not as victims anymore but as survivors who had looked into darkness and chosen, every day, to live in the light. After months had passed since the old man was taken away to prison and the couple had begun the fragile process of rebuilding their lives, the village slowly settled into a rhythm that seemed normal on the surface but was forever changed underneath. Because everyone who had lived through the fire, the disappearance, and the shocking revelation of what their neighbor had done could never truly forget, and the couple, though safe at last, found themselves constantly navigating between the desire to move on and the lingering shadow of the past that refused to fully loosen its grip. For every creak of the wooden floor at night, every rustle of the trees outside their window, every unexpected knock on the door carried with it the echo of captivity, the memory of waiting in the dark barn, unsure if they would live another day, and though they reassured each other endlessly with words of comfort and gestures of love, both knew that healing was not a straight line but a winding path filled with obstacles they had not anticipated. And one of those obstacles came in the form of whispers that began to spread in the village, whispers about whether the old man had really acted alone, whispers about whether others had known and kept silent, whispers that grew louder when a few villagers claimed to remember strange noises from his property long before the fire, or times when they had seen him carting supplies to the barn late at night, and the couple, already burdened with their trauma, suddenly found themselves caught in a new wave of suspicion and questions, forced to consider the terrifying possibility that the darkness in their village was deeper than they had realized, that their ordeal might not have been the twisted obsession of one lonely man but part of something more insidious, and though the authorities had declared the case closed once he was sentenced, the couple could not shake the feeling that the story was unfinished, that the silence left behind by the barn was hiding more than anyone dared admit, and so they began quietly investigating on their own, asking questions in hushed tones, revisiting places they had once avoided, piecing together fragments of memory that had been too painful to confront before, and slowly they began to notice patterns, small things at first, like the way certain neighbors avoided talking about the old man, the way others grew defensive when asked about nights they had seen unusual lights in the distance, the way some refused to even mention the barn at all, as though the very word carried a curse, and as their search continued they found themselves pulled deeper into a web of unease that seemed to stretch far beyond one man's cruelty, and though fear clawed at them they could not stop, for to leave the questions unanswered would be to surrender to the darkness, and so they pressed on, even when it meant reliving the worst moments of their captivity, even when it meant walking back to the ruins of the barn, where the boards still smelled of smoke and the ground still seemed to whisper with the memories of what had been done there, and as they stood among the charred remains they noticed something they had not before, a trapdoor half hidden beneath the rubble, sealed tight but unmistakably real, and when they pointed it out to the authorities they were met with polite dismissal, told that it was nothing more than an old storage hatch. Yet the couple knew in their bones that it was more, that the truth of their suffering was not confined to the barn but extended downward into the earth, into secrets buried for years, and that night they lay awake, clutching each other, wondering what lay below, wondering if the answers they sought would bring them peace or destroy what fragile stability they had built, and in the days that followed they felt the tension in the village grow, as if others, too, had noticed their discovery, as if unseen eyes were watching them once again, and though the old man sat behind bars miles away, the couple began to fear that his shadow had not been fully contained, that he had left behind something unfinished, something meant to outlive him, and the thought filled them with dread but also with a fierce determination, for they had survived the fire, they had survived the barn, they had survived his cruelty, and they would not allow whatever secrets still lingered to claim their lives again. And so with trembling hands but steady resolve they began to plan, not just to uncover the truth but to confront it fully, no matter the cost, because only then could they hope to finally be free, and as the first frost of winter coated the village fields in silver, they knew the time had come to descend into the darkness once more, not as victims this time but as seekers of the truth, ready to shine light into the shadows that had haunted them for far too long. The night the couple finally decided to uncover the truth beneath the ruined barn was one of those nights when the air itself seemed to hold its breath, the frost biting against their faces as they carried a single lantern and a crowbar to the spot where the trapdoor lay hidden under broken boards and ashes, their hearts pounding not only from fear but from the weight of knowing that once they opened it there would be no turning back, for the secrets buried below had waited too long to remain silent any longer. And as the man wedged the crowbar under the edge and pried with all his strength, the wood groaned as though it had not been touched in decades until finally it gave way with a crack that echoed through the empty night, revealing a dark hole descending into the earth, the smell of damp stone and rust rushing upward like a breath from some long-forgotten grave. And though the woman trembled, she steadied the lantern and whispered that they had come too far to retreat, so together they climbed down the narrow steps into a passage that wound deep below the barn, their shadows flickering on the walls. And the deeper they went the clearer it became that this was no mere storage space but something built with intention, lined with shelves where old tools, chains, and glass jars stood coated in dust. And when the woman held the lantern closer she gasped to see that some jars contained scraps of paper with names scrawled on them, names that belonged to villagers, names of people who had disappeared over the years without explanation. And the man's stomach turned cold as he realized they had stumbled into evidence of something far darker than their own suffering. Something that suggested the old man had not acted on impulse but had been part of a ritual or obsession spanning years, perhaps generations. And as they pressed forward the tunnel opened into a larger chamber where crude drawings covered the walls, images of fire, shackles, and faceless figures, etched in charcoal, and in the center of the room sat a wooden chest, its surface scarred and blackened by age, locked with a heavy iron clasp, and though every instinct told them to leave it untouched, the man forced the lock open with a rock until it snapped, and inside they found bundles of old notebooks tied with string, each filled with cramped handwriting, Diaries that revealed the old man had inherited not just the barn but a legacy of cruelty passed down from his father and his father. Before him, a twisted belief that pain preserved strength, that suffering cleansed weakness, and as they turned the brittle pages the couple realized that the old man had kept meticulous records of every person he tormented, and horrifyingly, there were entries written in the weeks they themselves had been prisoners, describing their fear and pain as though they were experiments rather than human beings. And the woman dropped the book in disgust while the man clenched his fists, furious that the authorities had declared the case closed when so much remained hidden, and as they argued in hushed tones about whether to bring what they found to the police, a faint sound reached them from deeper in the tunnels, a scraping, shuffling noise that made their blood run cold, because it was impossible for anyone else to be down there, or so they thought. Yet when they followed the sound they came to another passage blocked by rotting boards, and behind it, faint but undeniable, came the sound of someone breathing, and though terror gripped them the man tore the boards away to reveal a smaller chamber where, to their shock, they found signs of recent habitation, a dirty blanket, gnawed food scraps, and on the wall fresh scratches as if someone had been trying to claw their way out. But the chamber was empty now, whoever had been there gone into the night, and the realization struck them that perhaps the old man had not been working entirely alone. Perhaps someone else still walked free, continuing what he had begun, and the thought chilled them more deeply than anything they had endured, for it meant their ordeal was not an ending but merely one chapter in a much larger, more sinister story, and as they climbed out of the tunnels into the cold starlit air they knew they could not remain silent. They would bring the notebooks to the authorities, force them to see the truth, but in the pit of their stomachs both felt the dread certainty that the village still harbored secrets, that eyes in the dark fields might already be watching them, that the shadows of the barn had followed them home, and though they clung to each other as they walked back, determined not to surrender to fear again, they knew that survival alone was no longer enough. They would have to fight not just for themselves but for the truth, because only by exposing every hidden corner of the darkness could they hope to finally bring peace to their lives and to the village that had once been their safe haven but now was revealed as a place haunted by secrets too dangerous to ignore. The weeks after their discovery of the hidden chamber beneath the barn stretched into a tense silence that weighed heavily on the couple. For though they had delivered the notebooks and evidence to the authorities, though investigators arrived briefly with flashlights and official expressions, though promises were made that everything would be thoroughly examined, the village itself seemed to retreat into a deeper quiet, as if the very soil resisted giving up its secrets, and the couple could not shake the feeling that their decision to expose the truth had awakened something larger than themselves, a network of shadows that stretched back generations and refused to be fully revealed. And though they told themselves that the old man's imprisonment meant safety, each night when the wind rattled the shutters or when the barn's ruins creaked as if shifting in their sleep, they felt the same icy chill crawl up their spines, the sense of being watched by unseen eyes. And it was the woman who first began to dream again of the barn, vivid dreams where she wandered its halls only to find that the tunnel stretched endlessly into the earth, filled with voices whispering in languages she did not understand. And when she told the man he admitted that he too had dreamed of the place, that he woke drenched in sweat convinced that someone stood at the foot of their bed, silent, waiting. And though they reassured each other it was only the trauma speaking, deep down they both knew the truth, that what they had found was not simply the relic of one man's madness but the surface of something more enduring. And the evidence of this came one winter night when a farmer from the edge of the village knocked at their door, pale-faced and trembling, telling them in a whisper that he had seen lights moving among the ruins of the barn, lanterns carried by figures who vanished when he approached. And when he tried to tell others they dismissed him as tired or drunk. But the couple knew better, and they agreed to go with him the next night to see for themselves. So under the cover of darkness they crept to the barn with their lanterns shuttered low, their breaths fogging in the icy air, and sure enough, as they crouched among the trees, they saw the glow of torches weaving through the ruins, shadows of figures moving deliberately, as if searching for something, and when one lifted their face toward the stars the couple's blood ran cold. For it was not a stranger but a neighbor, a woman they had known since childhood, and beside her another familiar face, men and women from their own village, gathered in secret as though carrying out a ritual older than memory, and the couple realized with horror that the old man had not acted in isolation but had been part of a circle that still lived among them, hiding behind ordinary smiles and daily routines, carrying on a tradition of cruelty and secrecy that the barn had only been one small part of. And though every instinct told them to run, the woman gripped the man's hand tightly, insisting they stay to see more, for only by knowing could they hope to fight it, and so they watched as the villagers arranged objects on the ground, rusted tools, blackened wood, scraps of fabric that might once have belonged to the missing, and they chanted softly, words that twisted in the cold air, and though the couple could not understand the language, the meaning was clear. It was a ceremony of continuation, of binding themselves to the horrors that had come before, and suddenly one of the figures lifted their lantern high, sweeping the light across the trees, and for a brief, terrible moment the couple were certain they had been seen, their hearts slamming in their chests. But the light moved on and the figures eventually dispersed into the night, leaving the ruins once more in silence, and the couple, shaken to their core, hurried home, knowing now that their ordeal had been part of something much bigger, a chain of darkness that still coiled through the veins of the village, and they debated fiercely what to do, whether to flee and never return, leaving the place to rot with its secrets, or to stay and expose it fully, risking everything but perhaps saving others from the fate they themselves had endured. And as they argued, the lantern flickered low and the sound of footsteps on the gravel path outside silenced them both, for someone was there, pausing just beyond the door, listening before walking away into the night, and neither of them slept until dawn, clutching each other in the dim light, realizing that the line between safety and danger had blurred completely, that they were already marked as threats to the hidden order that pulsed beneath their village's surface, and yet despite the fear they chose to fight, for they could not allow what they had seen to remain in shadows. So in the days that followed they began to write everything down, every detail of their captivity, every page of the notebooks, every name whispered in the night, planning to send it beyond the village, to the city, to anyone who would listen. But as they prepared their letters they noticed strange signs. The post left unopened on their porch, their chickens gone missing, small piles of ash left deliberately on their doorstep, and they knew it was a warning, that their enemies were not hiding anymore but watching openly, daring them to act. And though the fear was suffocating, the couple pressed on, hand in hand, because the darkness had already stolen too much of their lives, and if they allowed it to silence them now it would only grow stronger. So they resolved to face it, even if it meant standing against their own neighbors, even if it meant uncovering horrors deeper than they had ever imagined. For in their hearts they understood the truth, that survival had brought them this far, but courage would decide what came next. And as winter deepened around the village, burying fields and roads in white, they lit their lanterns once more and prepared to descend into the tunnels beneath the barn again, not as captives but as seekers, determined to drag into the light every shadow that had haunted them, until the story of fire, captivity, and silence was no longer theirs alone but a warning for the world beyond the village, a story that could not be buried, no matter how many hands tried to keep it hidden in the dark. The village never truly returned to peace, not after the barn burned and not after the old man was taken away, because peace requires trust and trust had been shattered beyond repair, and though on the surface life continued with the sound of roosters in the morning and the smell of bread drifting from kitchen windows, beneath it all lingered a fracture, an invisible wound that never closed, and the couple, whose story had become the heartbeat of that fracture, lived each day with the weight of knowing more than most dared admit, for while the authorities filed their reports and claimed the matter finished, while neighbors tried to smile and sweep ashes from their doorsteps as though ashes did not stain the soul, the couple knew that what they had seen in the tunnels, what they had witnessed at night in the ruins of the barn, was not a relic of the past but a shadow that still lived, still whispered, still waited for its chance to rise again. And so they chose to leave nothing hidden, writing their story in notebooks of their own, filling page after page with details of the fire, their captivity, the faces of those who gathered in the night, the symbols etched into the tunnel walls, the way the ground itself seemed to carry memory like a wound that would not heal. And they sent copies of their words to every office and paper they could reach, to the city, to the capital, even beyond the country's borders, until their voices traveled further than the borders of their small home, echoing in places the villagers could not control, and though many dismissed it as folklore or paranoia, others listened, others came to investigate, and for the first time the couple felt that perhaps the darkness could not remain hidden forever, that light was beginning to seep into the cracks, but with the hope came danger. For the more they spoke the more the village turned against them. Neighbors who once brought bread and comfort now closed their doors. Whispers turned to open hostility, their windows shattered one night by stones. Their barn set ablaze again, though this time they managed to extinguish it before it spread. And still they stood firm, refusing to retreat into silence, because they knew silence was the weapon that had allowed the cruelty to flourish for generations, and they would not give it that power again, even if it meant standing alone. And so the epilogue of their story was not a quiet ending but a continuation, a battle fought in words and in resilience, in refusing to bend under the weight of fear, in teaching others that shadows thrive only when no one dares to name them, and though the village shrank around them, though friends became strangers, the couple found allies in unexpected places, people from other towns, journalists, students, even officials who had once turned away but now returned, compelled by the persistence of their testimony. And slowly a new community formed around them, not of the old village but of those who believed that truth, however painful, must be told. And with this new strength the couple began to rebuild not the house of their childhood but a new place, a place not haunted by ashes but by determination, a place where children could play without fear, where neighbors shared bread without secrets, and where no one would be taken in the night to be locked away in a barn, and though they carried scars and though the memories still came in dreams, the smell of smoke, the feel of rope, the sound of footsteps, they learned to live with them, not as chains but as reminders of what they had survived. And as the years passed and their hair turned silver, they sat often by the edge of the fields watching the seasons change, holding hands in silence that was no longer heavy but calm, knowing that their love had carried them through the fire, through the barn, through the tunnels, through the betrayal of their neighbors, through the endless shadows, and into a light that was fragile but real. And that was the ending they claimed, not one given to them but one they forged themselves, a defiance against darkness, a promise that what had been done to them would not be done to others, because they had spoken and the world had listened. And even if the village one day crumbled into nothing but ruins, their story would remain, a warning carved in memory, a testament to survival, and an epilogue written not in despair but in endurance. Because even in the darkest barn, even in the deepest tunnel, even in the silence of ashes, they had chosen to live, and that choice had changed everything.